Okay, here's our video today. RNA world hypothesis and the origin of life. And the key word here, though, we have to look at is hypothesis. Remember, a hypothesis is not a theory. It's an hypothesis. So there's no theory on the origin of life right now. It's just a hypothesis. And in the RNA world hypothesis, it's currently the most accepted hypothesis and the most supported. But there are others. But we'll talk about the RNA world hypothesis because it is the most accepted in the scientific community. And we'll talk about RNA in this video and ribose. Ribose is the key here too because ribose is a sugar that of course we needed for this to happen. Alright, let's get our pen ready here. And a key word also is, how did life begin? How did the origin of life begin? So, in a scientific way we're looking at. And there's this word abiogenesis. I'll write this down. Abiogenesis. There we go. Abiogenesis. Just how life just sprang up spontaneously. How did this life begin? And of course, in simple terms, as we go in through this video, it's through primitive RNA. So we'll talk about that. So this primitive RNA was the first self-replicating and self-catalyzing molecule. That's very important. Self-replicating. Let me write that down. So we'll say this primitive RNA, not the modern the RNA in our cells today, the different types of RNA, not the mRNA, but the primitive RNA doesn't exist anymore. This primitive RNA, and by the way, why it doesn't exist, it has evolved, right? So this primitive RNA was the first self-replicating. In other words, it was the first to make copies of itself, self-replicating, and self-catalyzing molecule. So in other words, it didn't need help doing it. So when a catalyst, we have catalysts all, like enzymes in our body. Catalysts help jumpstart reactions in our body. But with the RNA, this primitive RNA molecule, it could do it by itself. It didn't need help. That's the simplest term. It didn't need help to make copies of itself. And one thing what this primitive RNA could do is it could store information. And this information is genetic material. So in a sense, this primitive RNA, since it could self-replicate, was the earliest form of life. Of course, there is arguments of what life is. Like many of us will say that viruses are not life because they can't self-replicate. They need our cells to replicate, right? Viruses don't need energy and so forth. Whether primitive RNA needed energy is a whole other story. Now remember, this is an hypothesis that is supported, but there is no direct evidence. I should say that. Use another color. Put a line. There is no direct evidence for this. So why it's still a hypothesis. But, put all capitals here, but there is indirect. There is indirect evidence. In modern cells, we have, I'll write that down, in modern cells, our cells of everyone, in modern cells, we have ribozymes. we have, or the cells have, we should say, we have ribozymes. Not ribosomes, even though we do have ribosomes. Basically, ribosomes are made up of ribozymes. Ribosomes are made up of ribozymes. Let's look at a picture of that. And go back if you need to write it down. So here's a ribosome where eukaryotic. Remember, we have a nucleus. And there's 4 ribozymes in the ribosome that help code for proteins. So that's what a ribosome does, right? The RNA, the mRNA will leave the nucleus after it's coded the protein. It's coded the code, if you should know about translation and transcription, it transcribed whatever code for the protein was in the mRNA. Let's draw an mRNA. mRNA would enter, and of course it would now be coding for protein. So there is ribozymes. You can see the 4 of them here. 1, 2, 3, 4, helping the code for the protein. Here's a better picture. See this right over here, the mRNA entering, and maybe familiar with the codons, right? There's 3 nucleotide bases entering in, and of course they'll form a peptide chain, and eventually the peptide chain will form a 3D protein, right? And those little ball-like structures are the amino acids. So this primitive RNA, so the earliest form of life, would have used RNA, would have been primitive RNA, and then from there you see evolution happening. Now, the earliest form of life outside of RNA would have used the ribozymes to replicate and form a more primitive type of structure. And eventually you would have 2 ribonucleic acids, right? Diribonucleic acid is DNA. So eventually DNA would form. But the basic cellular structures that would have formed from this primitive RNA would have been lipid-based. So let's write that down. And remember, lipid means fat. So these structures that would have formed from this primitive RNA, and whether they're the earliest form of life or whether the primitive RNA is the earliest form of life, is a good debate. So let's make sure our pen's working. Where is the pen today? Do it with yellow. So this lipid, okay, I'm just trying to fix the pen here. So these little shapes here, and this would have been only like a 1 strand, not this whole figure here. They were called lipid micelles. Write it down. Lipid meaning fat. Lipids are fat. Lipid micelles. Lipid micelles. And if you think about the size, all this is smaller than atoms, right? So let's just make sure we have a size of these lipid micelles. And these lipid micelles would have used this primitive RNA. So let's look at, we're talking nanometers. That's the size we're looking at. So if we look at an atom, and atoms can range in size from 0.5 nanometers. And of course, they could be bigger. Uranium is much bigger than hydrogen, for example. And this primitive RNA, we'll just say RNA, the primitive RNA, could have been anywhere between 15 nanometers to perhaps maybe 180. So it's all depending on the size. And these lipid micelles, I'll just put lipid micelles to give you an indication, they could have been anywhere between 50 nanometers to perhaps maybe 200 or more. Circle that 200 there. And bacteria, to give you remember, our white blood cells are much bigger than bacteria, but bacteria use micrometers, but in nanometers, bacteria could be 2,000 nanometers and bigger, just to give you a size comparison. All right, so just to review, primitive RNA would have been the precursor for life, or they could have been life in itself, because we know they were the first molecule to self-replicate and self-catalyze. And then from there, you could have had these lipid micelles forming. And over time, you can have DNA forming, and then, of course, more complex life, as we see from bacteria and so on.